and welcome to another episode of Hybrid Healing Hour. Today, we are very excited to have a special guest with us, Dr. Seth Baum. Dr. Baum has been a mentor of mine for many years. He's one of the smartest people I know. He's a past president of the American Society of Preventive Cardiology. He's a lipidologist. He is the chief science officer of Flourish clinical research trials. And so today we thought it would be a great time to talk about clinical trials. So, Dr. Baum, you want to tell us a little bit about how you got into this?
Yeah, of course. And it's Flourish Research, and I'm the chief medical officer of the company. Just to give you background about the company, we have 17 sites in 8 states and growing rapidly. A number of other sites that we're going to bring on this year. So very happy to be in that role and happy to be working with you, both of you, in the clinical trials. So how did I get into clinical trials? Well, as you said, I started in cardiology. I still remain in cardiology, but I started in cardiology, expanded to out of interventions in EP into prevention and lipids. And then over time, especially through my relationships in the American Society for Preventive Cardiology, I got to learn more about clinical trials, about the importance of clinical trials, learn about drug development, something that we don't learn in medical school or in nursing school, graduate degrees, whatever areas of clinical medicine we're in, we just don't learn about this. So I learned more and more and recognized that this is actually how every single therapeutic we use it gets to market, how we have the capacity or the capability of using medications to help our patients. Every drug has to go through the clinical trial process in order to be approved by FDA so that we can utilize the medications to help our patients. So I looked into it more in 2015, started a clinical research site. In 2016, started Excel Medical Clinical Trials. Dr. Moraes, you've been a very active participant in that since its inception, and I'm very appreciative of that, and I think your patients are very appreciative of that as well. One of the things I recognized early on was that there's this misconception among patients oftentimes that in clinical trial work, the patients are guinea pigs. They're not being considered for safety issues and other factors. There's no potential benefit for them. So this is what a lot of patients have come to us with, that misconception. And the reality is, actually, in clinical trial work, the patient's safety is actually paramount. And we do everything to try to ensure safety as we're doing trials to understand the effectiveness or efficacy of the medications. There are also certain benefits to the patients in clinical trials. Sometimes patients can access therapeutics that there is no other therapeutic in that disease state, and so they can get this drug. And we've had a number of studies with very, very sick patients where they've been in these clinical trials and they've just done so much better in the trial. We could discuss that further throughout this discussion. Just a little additional background on how clinical trials work. We start with very, very small studies called phase 1 studies, with just several people, 10 people, 15 at most. And in those studies, we're looking to see how the medication affects the body and how the body affects the medication, how the drug basically works in the body and what the body does to the drug. These are important studies to really understand aspects of the drug so that we can then go on to later stages, phase 2 and phase 3, in order to broaden the studies with more and more patients. Ultimately, can be tens of thousands of patients in a given study. And as we move forward, we're always learning more about safety and effectiveness and efficacy. So the trials, in a sense, continue to get safer and safer for patients because we have a history, we have a knowledge base about a given drug, a given therapeutic. We call ourselves now Flourish Boca Raton. So each of our sites has taken on the moniker of its city, and so we're Flourish Boca Raton. We really focus on phase 2, phase 3 studies. We have done a couple of phase 1s, but that's really not what we spend our time doing. So that's, I think, a fair background, and we can, discuss many other aspects of clinical trial work.
Yeah. So I was going to ask, knowing now, because I was about to ask if you do any phase 1, like, do you do all of the phases? So you answered that, but how long are clinical trials? Like, I know some of them could be up to 4 years, or some are just a year. Can you kind of elaborate on the differences?
Sure. So phase 2 studies are typically shorter. They'll be, they can be 6 months, a year and a half. Phase 3 studies, particularly the studies where we're looking at certain events, like we have a certain type of trial called a cardiovascular outcomes trial, where we're testing a medication in a population typically that's high risk, meaning they're at risk for the things we're looking at, the events, for a heart attack, for a stroke, for development of worsening peripheral arterial disease, let's say. So we're looking at those events, and we have to, we take half the people and put them on placebo on top of standard of care, by the way. This is another misconception. They're not just on placebo and we don't give them other therapeutics. We give them the best of standard of care. So right there, when these patients are entering a cardiovascular outcomes trial, we ensure that they're on the best possible therapeutics, right? So that's a benefit for the patients. So half the people are on that arm, half the people get the standard of care plus the therapeutic or the drug that we're testing. So what we do is we know at the start of the study how many patients we're going to have in the study. We can estimate how frequently these events occur, how frequently do people in this risk group have heart attacks or require stents or bypass surgery, for example. And then we basically come up with a figure, a number of events that have to accumulate before we can stop the trial, because we know at the time when those events, when we hit that target number, we have enough statistical significance to be able to say yes or no, the drug helps or the drug doesn't help. So that's an event-driven trial in a cardiovascular outcomes trial, and that can be up to 7 years. That's on the far end. Typically, they're in the 4-year range. Sometimes they're as short as 2.5 years. But those are the longest of our trials, and those are all phase 3 studies.
So we get questions from our patients all the time. One of the more common questions is, why should I participate in a clinical trial? So what are the most common reasons why people do participate in clinical trials?
Well, it's interesting to look at that. So the most common reasons are patients want to help others because we learn about therapeutics and we bring them to market. All the drugs that patients are using right now that are helping them, all of them have gone through this process, and they understand that. And so they do it to help others. They also do it to help themselves. That's the second most common reason patients do it. So they understand that being in clinical trials often can actually improve them, right? We've done a number of outcomes trials with drugs that can help patients lose weight. And boy, do the patients understand that they're being helped in those trials, but other studies as well, not just that type of study. They also often will say that the reason they're doing trials is just to get better medical care, which is interesting and true. There are many layers of clinicians looking at patients when you're in a clinical trial. Lab work is done more frequently. Imaging tests often are done that otherwise would not have been done with that kind of frequency. And then finally, the final reason is for payment. Some patients, we do pay individuals to participate in these trials, and some people say that they like that. Okay, and that's why they're doing it. It is number 4 on the list of 4, though.
It's a nice little added bonus.
It's an added bonus. And the other part of clinical trials that's interesting and important to know is all of the tests that are done within the context of the clinical trial, that are done for the clinical trial, are free. Insurance is not a part of this. everything is taken care of and paid for.
And their information is all anonymous too, right?
Course,
Insurance companies don't have access to it,
no
unlike
access.
when you fill a prescription in a pharmacy.
No access to this. Yeah.
And so say you're following along with somebody and you have an incidental finding. Is that something that you guys take care of, or are you allowed to advise the patient on this? Are they allowed to seek help from other providers then?
So if we identify an incidental finding, meaning let's say we do a chest X-ray as standard in a given study, and we see a mass, we do two things. We let the patient know, and we let the patient's doctor know. We don't manage the patients. There's a distinction between what we're called the investigators and the patient's doctor. Investigators are always paying attention to safety. We're always doing everything to ensure patient safety, but we're not treating patients outside of the context of the clinical trial. So when we identify something like that, we have a conversation with the patient, we have a conversation with the patient's doctor, and then the patient's doctor will address it. It's interesting that you asked that question, because this happens more frequently than we like, because the things we find sometimes are not great things. We've identified malignancies in patients, but on the positive side of things, we're identifying these things earlier than they would have otherwise been identified. So it's another advantage for people to be in clinical trials.
Right.
Yeah.
I always explain it as, if we can have more eyes on you and it's at no cost to you, like, why not?
Correct. I totally agree with that.
And especially your eyes. I'm not going to lie. I mean, I'm honored to work with you.
There are lots of eyes. There really are lots of eyes. Our eyes at the site, and then we have others from this what are called the sponsor side of things. The pharmaceutical industries that sponsor these studies, because this is how drug development works. Somebody's got to pay for these very, very expensive trials. But they have a cadre of physicians looking at the data. So they could potentially identify something as well. Yeah. So there are many, many eyes on the patients.
And along those lines, for people who are involved in clinical trials now, it's very important that if your doctor puts you on a new medication, that you let the clinical trial know about it. Right. And for physicians who are listening to this as well, if your patients are in a clinical trial, make sure that any new medicines that's added, because that will affect the trial.
Or recommend getting approval first.
That's even better. Yes. I like the approval first. Look, if there's something urgent and a medicine has to be started in a patient in a clinical trial, obviously, you start the medicine. But there are drugs that we don't want used in certain clinical trials. They will skew the data. You're right, and sometimes there are potential drug-drug interactions. Right, so patients should always speak to their physician. Let the physician know, if the physician doesn't already know, that they're in a clinical trial. And then, if a physician recommends a new medication, please reach out to us, and we'll discuss it, and we'll call the doctor if necessary.
As a provider standpoint, I think you guys are very easy to work with, and I enjoy working with you for that aspect. I can just send a message and say, hey, this came up. I want to start this medication. Is it okay? And then I just get a response saying yes or no. Yeah. And then you guys add that to the med list, Yep. But, one thing we have a lot of patients who travel back and forth, like some live in New York or upstate, somewhere else for 5-6 months out of the year. And so I think a lot of people find that enabled or not allowing them to participate in these trials. Is that something you can comment on?
Yeah, it depends on the trial. Okay. So there are some trials where for a period of time we have very frequent visits. In those trials, you got to be around. Most trials, though, we have the ability to, because of the cadence of the visits, we have the ability to enroll patients who are in other states. And sometimes, in our studies on ultra rare disorders, we have patients who live in other states and don't live in Florida at all, who we fly in and out of the site. So we've done that. We've had patients in Texas, in Virginia, in the Carolinas, in Georgia, in Alabama, like all over the place. So it really depends on the study.
Great.
So let's talk about double-blinded clinical trials. That's always an interesting concept, right?
Yeah.
Do you want to explain what that means?
Yeah, so we're always trying to remove bias from studies. We don't want to influence the outcome of a study. So we randomize a patient to a therapeutic or not, and this is done through a computer system. So we don't know which direction the patient's going, and we blind ourselves and the patients to the therapeutic, meaning that we don't know what they're on. The patient doesn't know what they're on. So we can't, when we see a patient go, I think you're on that, I'm going to maybe do something a little different. We don't want to influence the outcome of the trial at all. All we want to do is protect the safety of the patient and ensure that the data have been acquired properly and accurately. So it becomes sometimes a bit of an issue because the patient's physicians are also supposed to be blinded. And for example, in a cholesterol study, at times, a physician who's maybe unaware of the blinding of the study will draw a lipid level and then make a recommendation for a medication that's actually prohibited in the study. So we like our patients to understand that their physician should be blinded as well, and that there's a purpose for this. And before they get into the study, we always try to maximize the therapeutics, so this will be a non-issue. So yeah, that's the blinding part.
Along those lines, so as you mentioned, I know there's been times where if we start a new med, say somebody's not in the trial, they have to be on that medication for like maybe 3 or 6 months prior to being able to participate in a trial. Yeah. I think that's quite interesting. Now, another thing about trials, I know from diabetic medications, weight loss medications now, we're doing a lot of cardiovascular risk assessment with, like, is it every new medication out there, or is it like, how would you say?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. I would not say it's every new medication. Okay. Diabetes was a big one, and that was because in 2008, FDA realized that a lot of the diabetes medicines had adverse effects on cardiovascular outcomes, and so they stipulated that in the future, every new diabetes medicine would undergo that kind of scrutiny with the cardiovascular outcomes trial. And what we actually ended up finding, as you know, is several of the therapeutics that were being used actually benefited patients from a cardiovascular standpoint. And now they're used for a whole host of different cardiovascular beneficial reasons. But outside of diabetes and cardiovascular related disorders,
and maybe kidney, because kidney disease is also associated.
So now there's this triumvirate, I guess, cardiovascular, metabolic, and kidney that's lumped together, and all those we understand have significant interaction and interplay. So typically we are looking at outcomes in the study of those medications.
But maybe not for dermatology medications.
No,
gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
But you also participate with liver trials and fatty liver disease. I'd love for you to touch on that.
Yeah, so liver is interesting because liver is metabolic and fits in that cardiovascular / metabolic. And we know, first of all, fatty liver is highly prevalent in the United States. And fatty liver with fibrosis, meaning scarring of the liver, is becoming more prevalent as well. It's now probably the leading cause of cirrhosis in the United States. Also is a major cause of liver cancer. Mm-hmm. So it's very, very important. We were involved we've been involved in many studies in fatty liver, but one with Madrigal, pharmaceutical company, which actually was the first drug to be approved for the treatment of fatty liver.
Oh, wow.
With fibrosis. This happened recently. There was a big New England Journal article that came out. I was very honored to be part of that journal article.
Yes.
So that, it was a big deal because it's the first drug in a disease to be approved. It's the only one that's FDA approved for this.
Wow.
We're still trying to find many other therapeutics because when you find one, you don't just stop. We think that that the disease state will require different types of therapeutics with different mechanisms of action to work most effectively in fatty liver. But back to the cardiovascular part, people with fatty liver with fibrosis or scarring have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, and it may be independent. It may not just be a product of the fact that these people tend to be overweight or have diabetes. It may be more than that. So that's that's part of the reason that it's so connected to cardiovascular.
And over the years, we've referred quite a few patients over to get FibroScans done, which is a great test that is completely, they don't have to worry about paying for it. They don't have to worry about their insurance paying for it.
It's not invasive.
It's not invasive. And it's a test that's not widely available. Now, some gastroenterologists are starting to do it, but for a while, there was no other place for us to get a FibroScan done.
Yeah, it's a great test. You're right. There are not many FibroScans out there. We have 2 at the Boca site, and we do a lot of FibroScans, to determine whether or not patients are eligible for these studies. You asked about different types of studies we do. We do Alzheimer's studies. We do pre-Alzheimer's studies, so people who are at risk but don't have any cognitive impairment. We do studies in diabetes. We do studies in heart failure. We do studies with lipids, LDL, LP(a). We do the NASH or now called MASH studies, obesity studies. Really the list goes on and on. They do tend to have. We are a specialized site in the cardiovascular metabolic kidney area, but we have gone outside. We did a vaccine study specifically looking at people with high cardiovascular risk. So that's how we tend to choose our trials.
Right.
Can patients participate in more than one clinical study?
Not at one time. So you can only be in one study at one time. Otherwise, we couldn't interpret the data. That's very important. The other thing that I think bears mentioning is we're trying very hard at Flourish to improve diversity in clinical trials. And you might ask, well, why is this important? Well, it's especially important, I would say, in the African American population, which has been significantly underrepresented in clinical trials, and a lot of reasons for that. But if a given population is underrepresented, then when we test the drug, we're not fully going to understand how the drug might impact that specific segment of the population. So Flourish Research has many initiatives that we're doing to improve that diversity aspect, and I think we're actually very successful at it. So very proud of that too.
Yeah.
Right. I know back in PA school, we were talking about how antihypertensive medications affect African American population differently. So yeah, it's just the more diverse you can get, I think, the better the results.
Yeah, totally agree.
And it's also amazing how clinical trials are just never talked about in doctor's visits or in medical school or any time. Most patients didn't even know they existed or that they were available to them. But there are places where people can find out what clinical trials are going on in the area too, right? Is there their website or a database?
There's clinicaltrials.gov, which is a national site that shows all the trials around the country, and you can identify trials in your area through that. You can also just look, go to our website, flourishresearch.com, and you'll see all of our sites and understand better the trials that are being conducted at all of the sites. It's interesting you say that doctors, don't know about it, and PAs don't know about it, and nurse practitioners don't know about it, about studies. Dr. Funt is a cardiologist who is an investigator at the site, and he was in practice for 40 years in Boca Raton, and I would say, certainly one of the most well-respected cardiologists around. He didn't know anything about the trials. And I'm not condemning him for it. He acknowledges this. He says, "Oh my God, I didn't know, and I wish I had.
Yeah.
Because the patient, we see patients all day long, and often we don't have, optimal solutions. And the trials give the patients an opportunity to try something else that they otherwise would not have available to them. So it's really important for physicians to understand better, what trials are out there, the value of trials. So I would suggest that any patients out there, talk to your doctors about clinical trials. You got nothing to lose.
Now, I want to circle back to the whole feeling like a guinea pig. Now, tell me if I'm wrong, but not all medications are quote unquote new, right? I mean, sometimes you're doing studies on a medication that we already have out there, already FDA approved for one disease state, but now you're doing a trial for a different disease state, correct?
That is true.
Okay.
Absolutely correct. And it's an interesting thing. So if you look at drug development, typically what will happen, this happens in cancer drugs, this happens a lot in cardiovascular therapeutics, happens in diabetes therapeutics. A drug it goes through the process of the clinical trials to get that first indication. Afterwards, we'll see something in those clinical trials, and that'll be signals of benefit and go, maybe good in that. Let's test that out. And so then other trials will occur. The drug's already been FDA approved, but not for an indication that we're studying. So it's still not an FDA approved indication. You're still going for the indication, but the drug has been on the market. You're absolutely right.
Have you had any trials where the outcomes just blew your mind? Have you had any that were just...
I've been very, very impressed with the number of results. I would say, if I'm going to pick one that blew my mind, it was a study in homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, which is an ultra-rare disease of LDL elevation, with a particular therapeutic that reduced LDL by 50% in a population that where we just don't see that. It's just so hard to reduce the LDL. So that was quite dramatic. Yeah.
And I can remember that we were involved in some of the trials with the GLP-1s and the GIP drugs, which are now commonplace, and nobody's impressed anymore with the weight loss you just expected.
Yeah.
But when we first started doing them, that weight loss was pretty.
I guess
impressive.
you're right. Those have been very, very impressive too. You're right about that.
I mean, that's where the people came in and they're like, well, I think I know which one I'm on. And it was just like, their fat was just like falling off. I'm like, I could see them at their follow-up and I'm like, wow, you look different.
Yeah. Which is a problem in those studies,
right,
obviously, because the patients who didn't see the weight falling off thought, oh my God, I got to get out of the study.
And I had a patient like that, and he was like, how can I get out? And I was like, please stay in it. Like I had to, constantly reiterate, like, just please stay in it as long as you can. Like,
yeah. And that's wonderful. You did that. There are consequences to getting out early that, it affects the data of the study. So there are consequences to the study, and there are consequences to the patient. With regard to the study, it can adversely affect our data, our ability to demonstrate effectiveness of a drug. With regard to the patient, though, especially in these outcomes trials, we know that even if you're on placebo plus standard of care, not on the drug, that your outcomes will be better. This is as a group. This is not necessarily on an individual basis, but if you look at the whole group, outcomes are better than patients who are similar to you in the quote unquote real world, not in the study. And it's not a placebo effect. It's the effect of, better supervision, being more attentive to your health issues. The participants in the studies, the patients, are more attentive. There's so many eyes, as we said, on them. There are a lot of reasons why it's helpful. So prematurely getting out of a study is just not a good thing. There's a very famous cardiologist, Eugene Brunwald, who's still at Harvard. He's 92 years old now.
Wow.
And is, he's the guy who wrote the textbook for decades. He's written the textbook in cardiology. And he was quoted as saying, if I ever have a heart attack, put me in a cardiovascular outcomes trial on placebo. So what he was saying is he knew that the placebo arm was going to do better than the real world arm. And you don't know that with the drug arm. We certainly have a lot of evidence to support it, but you kind of know it even more in the placebo arm.
That's quite interesting, actually. That sometimes that's a more of a certain result, Wow. Because you think okay, with the, with the drug arm, you would think, okay, well, it's either it's going to work or it doesn't work. But yeah, that's.
And the other interesting part of that is that so if the placebo arm is doing better than the real world, that means that for the drug to work, it's got to do better than the placebo arm, which is much better than the real world.
Right.
And that's always been a bit of an issue in clinical trials, because you just have to do so much better than real world. If you compare things just to real world, drugs to real world, sometimes they're more effective, but they don't beat the placebo. Mm-hmm. So, it's an extra level of certainty that a drug is doing the right thing.
I'm really glad you touched on that. Now, what about kind of going on his point? Can a person choose if they want to be in the placebo arm or the drug arm?
No.
Okay.
Totally random. Otherwise, it would skew the data.
Right. Okay.
Yep, totally random. Yep.
Are clinical trials all over the world done similarly, or are they different in the United States due to
No. So, when they're going for drug approval, they're all done similarly. Yeah. So almost all the studies we're in are international studies. Yeah, most of the studies are international studies. So they're done across the world, and it's for approval in Europe and elsewhere, and the United States as well.
So for a drug company, when they're trying to get the approval for something, they're working with your group here in Flourish of Boca Raton, but then probably multiple other sites. Is that why when we have a drug rep come to us and they're teaching us about the study, they show us the study and they say, this one had 5,000 patients. They take all the collected data. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
So that's how you get the statistical power of a study. You need a lot of patients. That's why studies are so expensive. Some of these studies can be $1 billion. So because if you have a study of 20,000 patients in 100 or 200 or even more, sometimes 400 sites around the world, it is really costly to conduct those studies.
And when people complain about the cost of brand new drugs, that's one of the reasons why. It takes a lot of money to get these drugs to market.
It's very, very expensive. Most drugs fail early on in development. Some fail later. And when I say they fail, they're not failing. It's unusual to fail on a safety issue. It's much more common to fail on an effectiveness issue. So they're just not effective enough. I've seen drugs after giant phase 3 trials that have succeeded, but not succeeded enough. So they've hit statistical significance, but not enough for the pharmaceutical company to commercialize the drug. And it's really interesting to see that. So they really, pretty much have to hit home runs in order to be successful. There's a law, the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed a year ago, maybe 2 years ago now, 1 or 2 years ago, that is problematic for drug development. So you asked the question earlier about drugs being tested that have already been approved. And I said, yeah, there are a lot of add-on therapies that occur, sometimes 8 add-on indications, excuse me. The act or the law actually starts a clock at the time of the first approval for the life expectancy of the drug, if you will, before the government can dramatically reduce the price. By doing that, it has disincentivized pharmaceutical companies from going after these additional indications. Oh. And it's I believe it's going to be a major problem in cardiovascular medicine and in oncology. And so people should look into this Inflation Reduction Act. And there are a couple of benefits to it, but many, many disadvantages.
That's unfortunate.
Very, yeah.
I hadn't heard that.
Me either.
Very interesting. So we talked a lot about clinical trials. Is there anything else that you want to add? Is there anything else you hear from patients that maybe we don't hear? Because we've touched on the reluctance of some patients to want to be in a clinical trial. Why should they be in a clinical trial? One of the things we didn't talk about that I hear from patients is that they're doing it to help their kids. They may have a genetic issue that they know is going to be passed down to the generations, and they say, well, yeah, I want to have a cure for them by the time they get to be my age.
Yep, that's the helping other category, but specifically with genetics, it's helping their family. You're right. We do hear that. I would say the overwhelming majority of people who engage in clinical trials are very, very happy that they've done it. So I think that I would say to patients, they should look into this and speak to their doctors and family members. There are opportunities there in clinical trials for them potentially that could be very advantageous.
And I know I actually have a couple patients who have tried to participate in the clinical trials with you guys, but they just don't qualify yet. And so I know they're in the database, and it's like, trust me, they will reevaluate you for every new trial coming up, but they're like, when can I get in?
Right. And you're right. And they become very disappointed when they what's called screen fail. When they screen fail,
right.
They're upset. They understand the benefit of being in the trial. Right. Plus the site in Boca is really nice.
It is.
It's a very nice site. Do you want to share your website with people?
Sure. It's flourishresearch.com.
And FLOURISH.com.
Yep. Flourish Research.
Oh, research.com.
Yep.
All right.
And Flourish is in most states, or is it limited to certain
currently in 8 states. Within probably a few months, we'll be in 10 or 12. So growing very rapidly. Great team running the company, and really just a good group. Very happy to be part of it.
There is a difference, though, for patients in doing something with a big research company versus doing it in a doctor's office who's maybe got just a handful of patients.
Oh my God, that's a very good point. So there's an enormous difference. In Flourish Research, we focus on a number of different things. I would say the first thing we focus on is quality. And there are quality systems that have been implemented that are just incredibly strong. We have quality oversight centrally, but also at the site level, at the local level, we have very, very strong quality systems in place, very robust SOPs in place. So there's a standardization across a big group of clinical research sites that you just don't get at the individual site level. As good as Excel Medical Clinical Trials was, and it was very, very good, this is just better. It's just such a step up. We focus on recruitment, so we understand better how to recruit patients. We focus on retention. It's also very important to keep patients in trials and to explain why it's so important for the patient to stay in the trial. So a lot of this is dependent on communication between the staff and the patient's physicians sometimes. And we made a conscious decision at the inception of Flourish Research to be a medical science forward company, meaning it's not just a company, that of course you have to be financially successful in a company. It's not just that. We want science and medicine to lead us, and we've stuck with that. And I think we're one of the only companies out there that has that principle.
Awesome. This was so helpful. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an honor to have you on our podcast.
Yes.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And please check him out at www.flourishresearch.com.
Yes. Thank you.
The information contained in this podcast is provided for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended for the purposes of diagnosing, curing, treating, or preventing any disease. This podcast is provided on the understanding that it does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. Before using any products or services referenced on this podcast, consult with your healthcare provider, carefully read all labels, and heed all directions and cautions that accompany the products. Information found or received through the podcast should not be used in place of a consultation or advice from a healthcare provider. If you suspect you have a medical problem or should you have any healthcare questions, please promptly call or see your healthcare provider. This podcast, including Dr. Brian Marias, Deanna Weilbacher, and Hybrid Medical Solution, do not claim responsibility for any adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for any statements made by the guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements and advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referenced.
If you would like to submit any questions or if you have any topics you would be interested in hearing about on future episodes, please contact us through our website, www.hybridmedicalsolution.com. That is solution with no S at the end. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook, all under Hybrid Medical Solution.